Hello, Pre-Calc Honors kids. This is day 2 of 5.1. I want to start with an opener. And this is the first 3 problems are simplifying the trig expressions. And the last 3 are just reminding you how to solve some equations. You can find this opener in your OneNote notebook under chapter 5.1 to 5.4. What I'd like for you to do is pause the video, complete the opener, and then I'll project the answers. By now you've completed your opener and you're ready to check your work. You may pause the video at any time if you need more time to look over your work, or you can take screenshots. So I have worked out the first 3 problems, and if there's anything on here that does not make sense, I highly recommend that you take part of any of my pre-calc live sessions so that we can work through these problems together. So here are my answers for 1, 2, and 3. And then if we go ahead, we can see my answers for 4, 5, and 6. As we move forward, you're going to really want to familiarize yourself with the identities that you were provided with in the last lesson. Okay. I'm going to start today's lesson with just listing a few strategies for simplifying, things you can look for. Number 1, look for Pythagorean identities. So we know that sine squared x plus cosine squared x equals 1, and you really need to familiarize yourself with all the versions of those identities. So we want to look for them. I also want to emphasize the strategies I'm listing. It might not be in the order in which I'm presenting these. These are just tools that you can use. Another strategy is to change everything into terms of sine x or cosine x. Again, you might not use this, but when in doubt, that's what I go to. So if I see a secant x or a cotangent x or whatever I have, I tend to change it into sine x and or cosine x if I cannot think of another thing that I can do. If I see I have a sum or a difference, I'm most likely going to want to find a common denominator. Sometimes I want to use conjugates to help me. Now this is a little broad when I say multiply by a conjugate. Remember, these are expressions. So all I really can multiply an expression by is a value of 1. So what I'm saying is if I'm going to use a conjugate, I'm really multiplying by the conjugate over the conjugate, because that equals 1. These are not equations. I cannot just multiply things by, for example, 2, and then I don't have another side to balance that. And the last strategy is to look for factoring possibilities. Once again, I'm not saying in this order. These are things that tools that I have to use, and I need to pull them out when possible. So my first few examples that I'm going to go through with you will all have the same direction. And basically, we're just going to simplify. And so for my first example, we're going to simplify secant x over sine x minus sine x over cosine x. I'm going to encourage you to pause the video and think of your strategies. I also want to mention that my approach might be different than yours. It does not mean that your approach is wrong. A lot of times with simplifying these expressions, and I think I may have called them identities. We're going to use identities, but simplifying these expressions, there's more than one approach. You just have to make sure your approach is mathematically correct. So pause the video and come up with your approach. Okay, so my approach was I just changed secant x into terms of cosine. And you can see I will do my best to follow suit with color coding. The only change I made is in a different color. So now from here, I'm going to simplify this. And I have 1 over cosine x sine x minus sine x over cosine x. And so think about your next strategy. And if you thought common denominator, you thought properly, at least for me. That's what I'm thinking about. So I'm going to go ahead and multiply this by sine of x over sine of x, just so that I can get a common denominator. And so I'm left with 1 over cosine x sine x minus sine squared x. Video and see if you can complete the problem. And you can see my work right here. If you need to take a moment to pause the video to look over my work, go ahead. Here's our next example, and our direction is still the same, is to simplify the expression. Look over it. When I see a sum and difference, to me, it seems obvious that I need a common denominator. Pause the video, find the common denominator. It just so happens that the common denominator is going to help me quite a bit because I have conjugates. Go ahead and simplify that. Here is my next step in my simplification. And now I'm going to finish it off. So I am left with 2 secant x in the numerator. And my denominator, after foiling that, I see that they're conjugates. I end up with secant squared x 1. I'm going to encourage you to look over your list of identities, in particular your Pythagorean identities, and see if you can finish the problem. Okay, once again, I would encourage you to pause the video if you couldn't get to the final answer and look through my work. There's no doubt this can be really challenging because you don't know your end game. And so it does take a lot of practice, and that's why you really should take some time and thoroughly go through the homework that I assign. Here is my third example. Once again, our direction is simplify. And we want to completely simplify. We want to get as far as we can. So my first thought on this is I just have a ratio, and I can only reduce ratios with common factors, and we don't want to forget that. We don't want to rush through things. So I'm going to factor out cosine x in the numerator and give you that guidance. This one is, I found number 2 to be a little bit more challenging than number 3. So I'm going to leave you at this time. I'm going to have you pause the video and have you wrap this one up all on your own. You can see that I have cosine x dividing by cosine x equals 1. I don't like to say cancels out. That implies 0. But they divide to 1, so we don't need to write that down. And 1 minus cosine squared x equals sine squared x. We're done. Here is my fourth and final example for simplifying expressions. After this, I will have a second video on solving equations from 5.1. Take a look at this. Some of the common mistakes students make is they just start dividing things out here, but I do not have a common factor. And when I look at this, I start feeling a little stuck. Now, some of you might have a different approach. It's fine. You have to make that decision for yourself. So I'm going to encourage you to pause the video and make your decision. The first thing that comes to mind for me is I felt stuck. So I just decided, I'm going to change everything in terms of sine and cosine and see where I can go from there. So where can I go from there? So my numerator, I have 1 over cosine squared x times sine x, and my denominator, this piece right here, I'm actually going to find a common denominator. Pause the video, find your common denominator, and write this where I'm putting a star as one term. So something that looks really complicated is going to get cleaned up quickly. So these two go together. I wrote that as the common denominator. Now, when I divide a fraction or anything by a fraction, it's really taking the reciprocal of that denominator and multiplying. So I have this Okay, so pause the video and see if you can finish this off. So there are 4 examples of simplifying expressions. I also want to remind you that through my math lab, you can, if this is not enough, you can go through my math lab. They also have instructional videos under 5.1 multimedia. You can also join a live session. I'm going to end this video, and then you'll have a second instructional video on solving equations.